Okay, so, all right, principles of complex systems. So there's a lot of crazy pieces to this course, and so today we're going to have sort of an overview of the whole thing. I'm going to tell you what's going on with this complex systems business, why it is, the great framing. We'll end with a manifesto, if we can get that far, depending on how much I monologue. So it is a bit of a monologuing class, so kind of where the bad guy says the monologue at the end of a movie. But it's a bit like that. We will have assignments and projects going through the whole thing. They should be interesting, complicated, different than what you've done before. I'll touch on that as we go through these introductory pieces. All right, so first of all, we have a website. Let me say that. We have a number of things in here. So there's a Twitter account, which you should follow. That's how I actually like to communicate with you people. We can use things like email as well, if we're getting really excited. So this is Season 8. I call it Season 8 because I'm trying to be hilarious. All sorts of things in here. So I guess I'll touch on this in the slides as we go through. But there's a lot of things in here for you to play around with. We can look at the previous one here too. Is that right? I'll show you the previous one as well because that's going to help. All right. I just subtracted you off there. All right. Well, let's start off with the slides and I'll come back to the website. Okay. Right. Okay. So it's a bit of a, did it die? Spinning ball of death. Come on. Yeah, it's okay. All right. Okay. So we have lots of silly things. So all these little icons will actually mean something, well, more or less, as we go through. As I said, we've got a Twitter account, we've got a hashtag, but that's just for optional joy. All of these are set in some master file of settings that I just change and updates. All right, so we've got a team behind this, Celia and Lammy Productions, and this is what we're going to go through. This is the first set of slides, but I'm actually only really going to go to here, and we'll come back and touch on these a bit later, right? So this is sort of the big pictures. There's some sort of philosophy of what's going on here. There is a finishing set of slides, which I call complexification, which kind of connects a lot of pieces right at the end. All right. So we're going to travel through a lot of different areas, and it's, not everything is the same, but I'm going to tell you about some stories that are really universal, right? And where that fails as well. But we're sort of living in this time of now massive amounts of data, which presumably all of you are exposed to in some way, even if you just use Facebook. And it's opening up all of these fields to talk to each other, right? The kind of approaches and ideas and so on that you need just to deal with the data actually is a really good connective story, right? And so one of the things we're building here, we have, I'm going to say all these things, but we have a complex system certificate. This is one of the core pieces of that. We also have Maggie Epstein's modeling complex systems, right? So it's more of a modeling one. I have a course that comes after this, which is complex networks, which has been the big story really in complex systems. That was the piece that brought it out of let's just make up stories and things are complex and let's try to solve everyone's problem into something much harder and rigorous. And of course the data, that was all part of data, right? That's all part of the data story. This is in the late 90s. Now everyone knows about data, but it's been taking off in lots of fields for a long time. Okay, so we've got that, and we're going to have something that's not in the slides. We're building now a master's in complex systems and data science, right? So data science by itself, I mean, it's the term that's taken off, and it's great, it's fine. Words are not quite right in some ways, but it's fine because it's being accepted. So complex systems is about, the real things you're going to be studying, right? The things you're going to be trying to figure out, whether you're working at LinkedIn or whatever it is, or Exxon or something. I mean, you could be working or the government, right? You could be working not just the NSA guys, but also just public policy, right? You might be trying to make a city a better place. You're going to be absolutely inundated with data, right? And that's New York City, for example, has a huge undertaking now with NYU and a lot of other places and cities around the world where they're just they're getting all this data together and trying to put it in the same box and figure out what's going on. That's hard, right? And some of it's just how the electricity's working, how the traffic's working, and then there's all the tweets, right? It's just a massive mess of stuff to figure out. Okay, so that's some of the stuff we're building, and this is all under the Complex Systems Center, which is also at the same time one of the 3 big initiatives at UVM, which are these TRIs, which are framed as transdisciplinary research initiatives. So they're framed as research things, but for us it's research and teaching, right? These things go completely together. Okay. All right, so there's going to be a bit of background here, and I'll tell you about some history. I'll touch on things, and then I'm hoping to get to here, depending again on my ability to speak coherently. All right, so we have within all of that, I have a team that I run with Chris Danforth, who's in math as well. I'm in math accidentally, as my fellow professors will tell you. I'll give you a little bit about my history in a little bit, so you know what's wrong with me. Okay, we've got a whole team. Some of these people have moved on. Isabel's now at Cornell. We have Cam over at University of Washington. Paul's at University of Colorado, being very tall. It's like 6'10". And Lewis is back in this place called Australia. So really nice team. If you get excited about some of the things that I show you, and a lot of these students have come through this course, or even linear algebra, actually, which is another course I teach. All right, so it's a computational story lab, which we feel is the right kind of framing. Right. It's all about stories, right? And that's kind of my thing. I'm going to tell you it's all about stories, and that's true of this whole complex systems thing, right? From raw physics to algorithms to human stories. So they're all stories of sorts. Some are hard and cold, and then some are interesting and messy. And anyway, so we'll get to that. This is a sort of a pictorial history of my research. I went to MIT. I did my PhD there. It was in math, but I worked in earth sciences and on biological problems. So you can see that this is the late 90s into the 2000s. So this is river networks, and so it's continental scale stuff, right? So that goes into this is branching. So this is really then branching networks, and it's a big data problem as well, because we had all these nice kind of theories and ideas about how those things work, but it became clear that we could describe it better, right? So of course we had satellites, so there's your transition in that field. Geomorphology, which a geologist think is silly because it's just a little bit on the outside, right? But geomorphology, extremely interesting because that's actually where we are. So that's all about that. Then we get to something like this, and you can't see, we'll talk about it in this course. It's to do with what's inside us, or our branching networks, the arterial and venal networks that keep us alive, and all other mammals, not many, but all of those other mammals, and various other organisms. So there's something there in branching networks, the structure of those things, whether it's universal, what kind of properties they have, what, if you're going to supply a system, and you can now start to think about cities and all sorts of things, what are the limits to what you can do, what's the most optimal thing you can do. Lots of other things. This is to do with forests, how trees fit together, kind of ridiculous. This is the small world problem, which we'll talk about here. So the idea of 6 degrees of separation, that you're not too far away from anyone you can think of in the world by connecting to a friend, to a friend, to a friend. That turns out to be social search and information search. It's a much bigger thing. This is about how optimal organizations. Lots of stuff in here about social contagion. This is the SARS epidemic. This is about fame, which we'll talk about in here as well. So I will thread a lot of things I've worked on. It's not just my work, it's a lot of other people's work, but that'll be part of it. Influentials. This is about the idea that Gladwell is completely wrong with that tipping point story, right? So, and then we get into other things. This is happiness. These are measures of happiness around the US and so on, from Twitter of all things. But that's actually from all sorts of texts. So in fact, this is Tale of Two Cities broken down, and so there's an examination of that. So it moves more into language and stories. This one's about drone warfare. So there's a lot of, and this is about philanthropy, so it's a bit of a mixed thing. Okay. All right, I like pictures, so we'll talk about these things. But there's a quick history. But it's really, I came to the US to work on complex systems, and I found my way into this whole networks business, which just erupted in 98, 99. Yeah, so this is just bad jokes in there, all right? So this is not what this course is. But I do like stories, so yeah. Anyway, all right. All right, that may happen now and then. Okay, and it probably means when I put on YouTube, I'll get in trouble. Okay, so this is where we are. You know these things. You've succeeded in that. You can email me. Somewhat good at email. Right, as I said, we've got a Twitter account. All right, good. So I'll be sending things out. So you should follow that. Is everyone on Twitter, or is it just not? Is it done? Should it be Snapchat? Should I use Snapchat? Twitter is pretty good, actually. So still, I think. It's hard to get simpler. Someone should come up with a 100-character thing and just beat it. Okay. All right, so we have, you can print things out and put them in a folder if you want. There's a syllabus and a poster. I'll talk about them here, but if you want, yeah. I'm not going to kill any trees. So here's an idea for office hours, which would be straight after this Tuesday class. We'll see, we may have to move these things. This usually happens. And then on Wednesday as well. So might make the Wednesday one a bit longer. But my office is over in Farrell Hall. That's where many of our students are as well. On the Trinity campus, it's the red brick building at the back. And used to be a library. And it's now where a lot of the people in the complex systems center are. Okay. I mentioned this briefly before. So this is one of the, well, it's still one of the 2 core requirements. We're going to have a third one soon, which will be Jim Bagro's data science courses. Right? So he's got these 2 courses. The second one is now underway. Some of you may be in that. But as a whole, we think this is a good package. Right? We're not just going to teach you to be people who just handle data and then hand it off to someone else. I think what you really want is you need to understand everything, or at least have a connection to understanding how it works. A system might work. You know, lots of things here. It's a huge, complicated mess. But you need to kind of, I mean, what's great about this is it's a sort of a Da Vinci time. You need to be back. You need to be a generalist again to some extent. You need to have some pillars of strength that you've built up, but you need to be, you need to be able to make a beautiful website, right? That's actually how we are starting to best tell our stories. Obviously, there are papers, which academics are excited about, but the things that have evolved, D3 now with JavaScript, and just the kind of that, because we're dealing with so much other, that kind of interactive way of passing on information, it's very powerful. Anyway, so we're trying to cover this whole story. So this is just about the certificate. As I said, we're getting to a master's and then a PhD. And there's a sequel to this course, POCs, Complex Networks, which I call CONCs. Has its own Twitter account. All right, so there are 3 versions for these slides, which are ridiculously big. There's, 30,000 lines of LaTeX now or something. There's this presentation version. There's a flat one, which doesn't have any of the little, pops up and down, so you just see the slides. And there's a handout if you want to kill some trees. You can print them out 3 by 2 and then scribble on them. Okay, so those things are around. You can actually, these are all PDFs, and there's a, we're still in the PDF world a little bit in LaTeX because you can typeset things, you can make it beautiful, but that is sort of starting to lift out of that perhaps to the web in a good way with something like MathJax. But it is, this kind of finished product. You can navigate, you can go backwards and forwards with these things, and you can search. So if you really get excited about these slides, right, so it pops back and forth. It remembers where you were. It will be full of web links, and they look like this. It's a huge addition to get Font Awesome in there. I've been working on the fonts, people. This is Open Sans. We're doing with Open Sans. So they'll be floating around. Also references. So if you're in this thing and you see a reference to something, you can click on it, and then hopefully when I push this, it will come up, right? So it's all embedded in the source material is all connected in there. Let's get back to this thing. Yeah. And then I can promise that, okay, so it works. Okay, so that's good. It's a juicy thing. You can also just go to the references here and mess around on them if you want. So they're all tied together, and it seems to work, right? That doesn't always happen. Anyway, so as I said, the citations have the links to PDFs if they're there, if I have a copy. Some of them are things I've scanned, because when I was doing my PhD, it was go to the library, scan the thing, come back, put it in a big pile. And at some point, I got a nice scanner, so I'm starting to scan those in. So some of them have silly comments in them. All right. I will link to Amazon for some books, just because I've spent some time doing that, and that's fun. You can click on it and go to the book. There's no actual book thing. So there's a lot of stuff behind these slides. If you're into LaTeX, it's Z-LaTeX now because of Unicode, Beamer, Perl. I know this is insane. Perl-Tech, which means there's Perl wrapped around LaTeX, wrapped around Perl. I know, and it's Perl. It's Perl. If you're into these things, then I know Python is whatever, but I use evil Perl. Lots of other things, and I like Emacs, which gets me some hate from the VI people. Anyway, so these are all good things. Wow, yeah. No, they really get upset. Emacs, you can kind of do everything, of course. All right. I mean, I have my personal journal in Emacs since 98 or 9 or something. Yeah, 97. Yeah, it's a great place to be. Just grep. Okay. So it's season 8. We're going to call them lectures. Not sure if that's going to come up. They're bottle episodes, which is my little joke. You can click on these things, right? Right. Bottle episodes. Does anyone know the trope, the bottle episode? So you're in a sitcom, the 10th one or whatever in the show. There's like the light on money, and someone gets trapped in a subway. They all get trapped in a subway, or they can't get out of their room, right? And it's all filmed in that particular location. So you guys are in that situation. So bottle episodes. I think these link to community. Not sure why that's not working. Anyway, so let me go to a previous version of this. So eventually what happens is you'll have all the episodes and slides will appear like this. There's a guide, right? So you can click on this one, and then you've got all the episodes, which are slowly loading because we're in UVM. It's like sucking it through a straw. And then the slides are here as well, right? So you can click on all these guys, and it's a bipartite affiliation network. So you're here, and you're like, okay, I'm going to look at the videos that these things are in. So you can go backwards and forwards. It tells you which slides are in it, blah, 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 blah. All right, so that's eventually going to appear. At the moment, we just have, this time, we just have these guys. Okay, so I put the slides up. If you want, you can get at those, but there are, of course, no videos. All right, I think it's probably wrong to play a video inside the other. Let's see if these are working. Are they bad? What's going on? Oh, okay, now you want to do it. All right, good. Yeah, okay. So there's going to be madness like this. Okay, I just want to play that, so it's going to be in the video. All right, so let's see. So I'll fix that up. All right, these courses I've developed have been supported by a career grant that I was fortunate enough to get. And as I said, I'm in math, but not really, because I'm kind of in all sorts of places. So, and the award actually came from, I've got one more year, it came from the economics side of things, right? So as I said, I was at MIT for 6 years, and then I spent 6 years at Columbia, where I was a postdoc and a research scientist, and I was in sociology. So I have kind of a messed up background. We did a lot of interest. I'll talk about the colleague that I work with there, Duncan Watts, later on. He's a pretty famous dude, and he left academia and went to Microsoft Research, as people want to do. All right, so that's just a shout out to our friends at NSF, and they should give us more money from their huge coffers. I don't know why they don't just give us wheelbarrows. Okay, they don't. This is still kind of the plan, right? We're actually going to have projects and talks. And so there'll be talks halfway through the course and then at the end. The end is going to be complicated because I have a conference in Japan, so we'll have to talk about that. But that's, December. Okay, so yeah, maybe 9 to 10 assignments, depending on how we go. I want you to understand a few things. There'll be a lot of specific things we can just see, like, this is how it's done in this area. If you're not familiar with it, wow, this is nuts. And there'll be a thread of some work that I really want you to understand. You should turn up, not just watch the movies. And you can yell at me and talk at me and these sorts of things. Put hands up. Yeah, so the idea is, well, we'll see. So, but first talk, second talk kind of thing, and then there's a project. And I'll give you a template for writing up the paper, which I've been working on for a long time, I guess. I'll put it on Git. And the idea is that this, okay, so, am I going to say it here? I might say it here in a little bit. Yeah, I'll come back to projects in a bit. Grading works like this. We have the Department of Truth, which is to say we have an anonymous grader who will be grading. This is the way it works. Each question gets a 3, 2, 1, or 0, so it's a bit like an ABC. Seems a little fun, but this is actually a great way to grade. It works for both sides because there's less arguing from everyone. You know, the grader as well doesn't sit there thinking, is this a 13 out of 17 or a 14 out of 17? And it cleans up when you go through the whole thing. So that's how that works. These are things you probably know about. I'm just including them. You can always escape at these points. These are escape points. Informed consent, you know, kind of like those things. All right. I guess, yeah, okay, we'll come back to, I'll mention projects again in a little bit. Okay, so as I've said, we're going to be surfing around a lot of different areas. There'll be some little bit of coding and data analysis and that sort of thing. There'll be some math, some of that horrible stuff, and you know, we'll set these things up. But different kinds of flavors. So it's a little scary. We're moving from, in this course, from, you know, hear all these things, work them out, blah, 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 do all these things, but we're going to sort of get hold of some real research problems. We'll go through some of the classic works, and you can kind of basically reprise some of these performances by these sort of champion scientists about these great problems, which I'll tell you about. So that makes it a little unnerving, perhaps, but it's all good. It's all good. It's a big support system. But the idea is to kind of open you up and say, oh, you know, it is messy. When you get to research, it is messy. Or it doesn't matter if you do research or not, just thinking about problems in the real world. You know, you've got some ton of data or some experiment, whatever it is. Often it's much more messier than people like to think about science. You know, they like to think it's, oh, I have a hypothesis and now I'll test it. You make up the hypothesis later on, you know, usually, and you tell people you had one. You know, you never mention the fact that it's completely different to, even if you did have a hypothesis, anyway. So our hypothesis is that this is interesting, right? So that can be proved or disproved, I think, about a particular area. Okay, so major things. We're going to have a manifesto, and this notion that complex systems is basically what we're doing now. It's science, right? It's this transition out of reductionism, which is incredibly important, had to be done, and will still be done, but okay. Limits to things, right? So this is a strange business that we're also going through. We had this wonderful time where we're able to write down little equations that solve things, sometimes big equations that solve massive things. You know, fluid dynamics is a great example of complex systems, actually. I mean, and I'll mention it now and then, but it's one of the great examples. We actually have an equation which, you know, you would derive if you're an alien or whatever. You would figure this equation out, and it applies to just an enormous number of phenomena, right? The blood inside us, atmosphere, the Earth itself. I mean, it's really quite extraordinary. So you know, we've had these great achievements, but as we kind of move up, that's physics, right? As we move out to things that are more involving algorithms, and I think the advent of life is the advent of algorithms. It's when you step out of raw physics into algorithm worlds, some if-then kind of statements, physically embodied in chemical and physical things. But as you lift out of that, it gets messier. So, you know, and you just try every time. You're like, okay, here's a system. Can I explain it? You know, can I describe it? Can I explain it? Emergence. It's a word that gets people a little kind of confused, but it's a great word, and it's about this kind of micro to macro story, right? You have water molecules, you have a tornado, right? You don't have a tornado inside a water molecule. So we'll cover that. That's a piece down here. Right, so the macro behavior is fundamentally different to the micro. So two big threads in all of this are universality, and that's why we can actually talk about systems in a general way. It comes from physics. Leo Kadanoff is the character here who really kind of framed it, but the idea that many micro kind of arrangements of systems can lead to the same macro behavior. Right, so you can change the details a little bit. Fluids, again, another good example, right? Honey and water behave in similar ways. You change in viscosity, but you don't have a separate equation for honey, right? You don't just have I mean, you might quite reasonably think that from the start. Once you realize that equations could work, which is a huge step, you might think, oh, we need a special equation for honey, a special equation for milk, a special equation for water, but that's not true. We have a universal one. Lots of other things, right? So the normal distribution. We'll talk about that. That's a beautiful example. And then we'll talk about what's really going on, the statistics of surprise. Okay, we'll get to that. Okay, but the accidents of history, right? So you've got DNA, you've got these fingers on your hands. I mean, maybe people argue about whether this is sort of actually something that would have emerged if you ran the whole thing again. I don't know, right? Right? You always get, you certainly always don't get the English language, for example, right? I mean, there are some weird things, but maybe you get some properties of language that you will always get those, right? There are some things that go across. So there's this flourishing of structures. You have DNA, right? We have DNA, okay. Did we always have to have that? I don't know. All right. So a couple of big pieces in here will be scaling. Lots of different kinds of scaling, right? As you look across systems, so if you look across organisms, right? You've got a tiny little shrew up to an elephant. You know, how do the features of those things change? What about organizations? What about cities? Lots of scaling theories have come out recently about cities in particular, right? So things like wealth, poverty, these sorts of aspects, but also creativity, disease levels. You know, how do those things change with size? Networks are a big piece, just because everything's full of networks. Something we want to know a lot about, of course, with systems is robustness and failure, right? So a lot of the systems we see are robust because we keep seeing them, right? So they're around, they're holding themselves together, but sometimes things explode, and we want to know about that. I think, well, so some Italian scientists were arrested a few years ago, and I think, maybe I'm wrong, I think I saw a headline that they actually went to jail for saying that an earthquake that was coming up was not going to be, right? Is that right? That was not going to be that bad. And it turned out to be bad, and then it was, right? So, I mean, that's a really hard area of prediction. And, it's kind of a difficult reaction to stomach, to be honest. So, okay, why complexify, right? That's a good question. I mean, there's the Big Bang, so the physicists like this one, right? It's a very good framing, by the way, Big Bang. Mathematicians don't have good framings, really. They can't explain anything to the outside world. It's a hermetically sealed box, right? It's like, go away. But most other fields have a story, and that's a good one, right? So there's the start of the universe sort of thing. Of course, a little bit mysterious, right? But then we have this, what's the ratchet? Why are things ratcheting up after that? How inevitable is that? I mean, you run the universe again, you just always sort of get like a little sort of bowl of dust, like ash. Is that mostly what you get? Or people have thought about this a lot, and I'm going to say it's all about stories when we go through all of these things. All right, we'll actually kind of have a narrative for the whole business. I'm going to say a little bit more about these things just quickly. So scaling phenomena, there's a range of pieces. That'll be our first part, and then some material towards the end of the course. So we're going to look at distributions that are surprising, right? So normal distributions, not surprising. And they're everywhere. But the ones that are really also everywhere are these parallel size distributions, or these heavy-tailed distributions, or fat-tailed distributions. So again, earthquakes, wealth, for example. So if you select people from, say, the US at random, then most of the time you get people who don't have a lot of wealth. Right? And if you keep doing it, and you get someone who's got, okay, now we've got a millionaire, right? But then you go back, not a lot of wealth, not a lot of wealth. If you're really lucky in a sense, you would get Bill Gates, right? But that's, right? But if you're looking at their height, you start to get a nice normal distribution very quickly. You see that. So the other one is the wealth kind of distributions are what I call statistics of surprise. And they're the ones that trip us up, especially in financial systems. Okay. So Zipf's law, very famous, comes out of, and it's connected with this, it comes out of language. Right? So simply counting words in a book. How many times does the appear and of appear, and how many times does sesquipedalian appear? Right? So you've got this distribution, these things are connected with each other, and there's a work by a student who was in this class maybe 4 or 5 years ago who's part of our team, Jake Williams, that really built on this in a beautiful way. So that's coming up. He may give a lecture at some point. Okay, so this is sort of describing what's going on. One thing that will follow through is mechanisms, right? How do these things come about? Where do they come from? And we understand the central limit theorem, and we can see why it's ubiquitous. But these guys appear for all sorts of different reasons. And I'll give you, we'll go through a big general one, and we'll have a look at a bit of a fight there by very famous scientists. Definitely get into the history of science here. So I talked about social phenomena. This is for cities. Waste as well, consumption and waste. You can think about this now. You can measure it. Scaling biology, okay, as I said, and how you might be able to kind of go across these different shapes. And so the word from physics is renormalization. Networks. So we'll have some fun with networks. So it's going to be, it turns out that it took a long time to figure out what the structure of real complex networks was. And again, it's data appearing. There was a lot of work done on random networks, which are it's a beautiful field. So Paul Erdős and other characters, very famous people who couldn't butter their own toast, were involved. And it turned out the real world has absolutely none of those networks, like 0 of them. You will never find one of those networks. So if you reach into a box of random networks, the one you pull out, you'll never find it. But there's enough in them, in that theory and so on, to be able to, you can generalize it to start to think about real world ones. And then a lot of this is then about the mechanisms that give rise in these so-called scale-free networks. Again, it's a scaling thing. We'll come to that. The mechanisms that give rise to these networks turn out to have a pretty universal kind of story. So there are these are the two that set off the whole complex networks craze, and the other one is the small world business. So we'll come to that. That's a search thing. All right, modularity, hierarchies. So you have all these systems. Networks has allowed us to figure out what the kind of gross structure of these things is. Right? Whatever it is, food webs, social networks. How are they? Are they a big homogeneous group, or are they splintered? All sorts of things. I mean, the books that people buy versus the books themselves. Right. Okay. I talked about robustness and failure, so we're going to have this. We'll get to this notion of highly optimized tolerance. Again, there'll be an argument between a couple of famous characters. Pretty good framings here. HOT. This is the HOT theory. So it's systems that are really well engineered, if you like. They're beautifully made, but if the conditions change enough, they can explode. So that's sort of the story there. And again, it's an argument for why these power law size distributions might appear, but it's robustness and fragility. These are these two good words. All right. I talked about the small world thing a little bit, so we're going to think about search. So how do you search? How do you navigate your way around networks? How do you think about how to structure language? How is it, language, information. How is it structured anyway? That's here. All right. What I call socio-technical systems. So we'll have a lot of work. We'll start off with spreading, and we'll think about disease spreading, and just some basics there. Actually, Pandemic. It's a good game. If you've played Pandemic, it's pretty much some of these models are in there. So we'll talk about some of these older models. This is from the 70s and so on. Modeling things that aren't good, certainly. Things that happen all the time, imitation. So we'll get into this, and this is all about, essentially, stories and what I call socio-technicine. Okay, I have some... Because of the... Okay, so I'm going to have... There's a couple of little videos. This is... the whole social science thing is opened up, right? So this is an older piece from Feynman saying somewhat rude things about the social sciences, but it's changing, right?
Because of the success of science, there is a kind of I think a kind of pseudoscience that social science is an example of a science which is not a science. They don't do scientific. They follow the forms. You gather data, you do so and so forth, but they don't get any laws. Haven't found out anything. They haven't gone anywhere yet. Maybe someday they will, but it's not very well developed. But what happens is, at an even more mundane level, we get experts on everything that sound like they're sort of scientific expert. They're not scientific. They sit at a typewriter and they make up something like, food grown with fertilizer that's organic is better for you than food grown with fertilizer that's inorganic. May be true, may not be true, but it hasn't been demonstrated one way or the other. Where they'll sit there on the typewriter and make up all this stuff as if it's science, and then become an expert on foods, organic foods, and so on. There's all kinds of myths and pseudoscience all over the place. Now, I might be quite wrong. Maybe they do know all this thing. But I don't think I'm wrong. See, I have the advantage of having found out how hard it is to get to really know something, how careful you have to be about checking the experiments, how easy it is to make mistakes and fool yourself. I know what it means to know something. And therefore, I see how they get their information. And I can't believe that they know it. They haven't done the work necessary, haven't done the checks necessary, haven't done the care necessary. I have a great suspicion that they don't know that this stuff is, don't know, and they're intimidating people. But I think so. I don't know the world very well, but that's what I think.
So that captures a couple of pieces, which is, first of all, the physicists are incredibly obnoxious. And they kind of know it. They do know it. They can be self-aware enough. There's a good XKCD picture on that. If you haven't seen it, well, I'll probably pop that up. And that this is changing, you know? I mean, maybe it's certainly true. But if you go back in time with physics, it was the same thing, right? Physics was full of crazy ideas. And what happened with physics is the data became better and the experiments became better. And you couldn't just make things up anymore, right? So, you know, the ether disappears, or maybe it will reappear, I don't know. But phlogiston goes away. Like all these ideas of how things worked. I mean, thousands of years, Ptolemy's view, right, of how the planets went around the sun. Of course, just the fact that the planets went around the sun was a bit of a controversial issue. So, you know, physics took a long, long time before it, you know, emerged from what he's decrying here about the social sciences. But you know, these things are now changing in the social sciences, but it's a different kind of field. You don't have hard Newtonian mechanics. You have a lot of probabilistic stuff. And that's the thinking that you really have to get into your head. Statistical, probabilistic, and it's very hard for people, right? That's hard, I think. It's really kind of the worst thing for our brains. And we're good at some kinds of probabilistic thinking, you know, what's going to happen next. But we can get tripped up. Famous statisticians get tripped up by, you know, little quirky probabilistic problems. So they're just not intuitive. We just, you know, you can have your savant type character who can multiply two 20-digit numbers together like that, but you can ask really weird probabilistic things that our brains just, because we want to tell stories. I think that's really it. We want to tell stories, so we have a lot of trouble seeing the narratives of probabilistic things. Anyway, so that's, you know, and we'll come to this again. I have a piece that's actually from Radiolab, which talks about this kind of limit of what we can do, right? It's well put together, but it's the limits of what we might be able to explain when we come to things like, you know, biology, certainly, which is a hard business. I mean, it's just a hard business. All these little molecules that do things, and you have to figure out what they are. But there may be big stories there that we can, in fact, you know, sort of explain in the way that it would make a physicist happy. Okay, this is just a little...
Penny! 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 This is for you.
Hello, Sheldon.
Hi.
What is this?
It's a questionnaire I devised. I'm having some difficulty bonding with a colleague at work, so I'm doing a little research to better understand why my current friends like me.
Yes, well, that is a good question. But is this really the best way to figure it out?
Yeah, I agree. The social sciences are largely hokum. But, short of putting electrodes in your brain and monitoring your response to my companionship, this is the best I can do.
So made-up physicists are also incredibly obnoxious and very accurate kind of thing. Anyway, all right. That's how they think. Okay. Anyway, but we're making a lot of headway these days, I think. Get this thing to work. All right. Okay, a few more topics. We'll talk about actually voting, how you know, ways, systems for getting voting to work, the wisdom story for crowds, right? So there's the wisdom of crowds and the madness of crowds. They're separate books. Madness of crowds is from the 1800s. Wisdom of crowds is sort of a recent Socio-technical, I think you say his name. But yeah, we understand pretty well now how these things can go wrong. So we'll play around with this, and we'll look at how this feeds into fame, how things become famous, people become famous, and things become famous. That actually is all connected. As I said, large scale, so I talked about cities. I may throw in some of our work about happiness just at the end because it's fun. Twitter, of course, there's all sorts of patterns coming out of that. So, movement of people, I mean, this has just been this thing that's emerged in the last, obviously people have moved around for a long, long time, but the data that we have is quite extraordinary. So I will have this thing, I'll just show you a tiny bit of this, but basically there's going to be, I'll explain what this is. So it's how to become famous. Turns out to be kind of hard, but there is a reasonable way to do it. All right, so we'll get to that. There's really no reason for the extra things here. Okay, it's to do with spreading, how things spread, and it's to do with how you behave when you generate things that spread. All right. So, okay, so there's just sort of a little overview of some of the topics. I'm going to try and just put on one page here then a narrative arc for the course. So we're going to start off with this manifesto, probably. There's going to be certainly a lot about socio-technical systems, right? Because people plus computers all around the world, I think it's the socio-technicine is this big, big story, right? Amazon just bought Twitch, sort of a side note. Amazon just bought this, right, this platform Twitch, which people simply watch other people playing computer games. And I think it has as many viewers or viewing hours as MTV does now. It's huge. It's a pretty funny thing. I mean, last night, the main page, they had people playing King's Quest, which is from 1992, which is kind of incredible, that's still totally cool. Big deal will be this, size distribution of system elements, right? Whatever they are. So it could be the wealth of individuals, it could be how connected individuals are, or how many friends they have on Facebook, or, well, Facebook actually has a cap, doesn't it? But how many followers on Twitter, that sort of thing. Lots of different, so, and it could also be, the number of times a word appears in a book. That seems pretty benign. The size of earthquakes, right? That is a much more serious thing. So this power law size distribution thing is something you have to get your brain around. It's a bit messy, it's complicated. That's description, understanding what's going on. And then we want to get to this stuff. We want to explain how these things come about. And as I said, lots of different mechanisms, but I want to give you the main ones. And also just the general knowledge that there are lots of routes to get to these kinds of statistics of surprise. We'll talk about robustness, again in this kind of general way, what kinds of systems might explode under what kinds of conditions. So it's system, you've got this network of whatever it is connected, and you've got some dynamics on top. Which things coupled to which will make them blow up. So this is an eternal area of interest, and gravely affecting people, society, and all sorts of systems, and connects into this. So then we'll connect into complex networks, basic structure, how things might grow, networks, how certain kinds of networks that we see, not universally, but very widespread, how they might grow. Again, it'll be connected back to this work. And then some behavior on top of them. This is a giant field. I mean, it's an insanely big field now. But I'll tell you about these things, as I mentioned before, but they'll fit into the networks framework. How things spread, how things become famous. This word allometry, allometric scaling in, so this means other measure instead of isometric, allometric. So it's about funny, strange scaling, actually. So in complex systems in general, there's all sorts of things here. There's, for instance, the Moore's law is one example, right? So that's a kind of a scaling with time of price or the ability to produce something. There's all the stuff with organisms. There's stuff with organizations. Even things like how the shapes of nails, right? As you go up through nails, there's all sorts of that, and that has a good engineering story. But it's a non-trivial kind of scaling. Okay, we're going to have a theoricide unit. Someone killed a theory. That's going to be part of this. That's a little bit of a fun thing for me to tell you about. It's to do with how much energy organisms use per unit time, which is a big deal, right? You've got all these little guys running around, soaking up oxygen and food, and then some big ones running around. So all of these things add up to give you an ecosystem. And so how does that work? So this is something where, biology, very messy business, lots of funny things on the insides of organisms and so on, but maybe there are general stories that physics kind of puts on top that holds things together. And then complexification, so the theory of anything, right? So the physicists want the theory of everything, which would actually tell you nothing, right? So this is how it all took off, and then, well, why do things keep complexifying is a different piece. I mean, I think we have good handle of some of that. But okay, so this is the theorist side. This is just my amusement. It will do death by fractions. So there's this guy gets killed by this guy, and or not, or maybe not, right? So I'm just amusing myself here. All right, obviously there's this one. Yeah. So we'll explain this. This is going to come later on in the course. You can see revenge is possibly going to work out here. All right, so you can get to this online. There's the layout of the whole thing, okay? You get to Thanksgiving where you forget everything, and then generally you have to have exams, which is that's part of the test, really. It's actually, all the tryptophan. Can you do an exam after that? All right, so that's generally the plan. Okay, so we're actually going to build a little course map this time. So, kind of a little path that we travel around. You can think of Raiders of the Lost Ark or Lord of the Rings or something, or just a normal map. So we're going to visit this place, the Snormals. So these are normal distributions, right? Nothing very surprising about these guys, but we're going to kind of touch on that. We're going to visit these ones. So these are the unexpected mountains of reality. Mounts most of the time are all these little guys, but there's some other interesting ones in there. So we're getting postcards from our trip through this thing. All right, I try to make the other ones a crime scene, but they're not. So there are different ways to get to these places, and I've kind of said this, right? So that this is in some sense the central limit theorem, right? So the random walks, which we'll talk about, random walks are awesome, and we'll talk about them. Because randomness, as I said, statistics probably, randomness is a big, big feature of everything. Okay, so this is just a nice little random walk, takes you to the Snormals. It's through the forest of forgettable events. There's something to do with t to the power of 1/2. And this is one way to get to these to get to the unexpected mountains, and it's through a very strange kind of road, the trees of unusual size. So we'll touch on this. Yes, so that'd be one way, but we'll get to it from different. We'll get to these unexpected mountains from different paths that aren't even paths, but they're mechanisms, right? They're ways of traveling towards these kinds of distributions. All right, so there'll be postcards. All right, so the projects. So actually, I said teams of 2 or 3. You can work by yourself, absolutely. And in fact, that's pretty much as we've always done it. You can certainly work by yourself. You might want to work in a group of 2. Let's say 1 or 2. If you want 3, that's okay. So I do have a whole bunch of possible things to work on. I can suggest them to you. At some point, I'll throw them in. And you can certainly do everything from just, novel research, I'm going to save the world, or, I want to study this data set, whatever it is, I'm going to explain all of Yelp, whatever it is, or, I'm in biology and I have this thing to do with hamsters that seems to be a complex system. So if you're a graduate student, you might have your own thing lined up, and you can talk to me about that. So I'm happy to kind of support the development of a project. On the other hand, it could also just be, here's a really interesting paper, it's from 3 years ago or 5 years ago, and it's a big deal, and everyone thinks it's a big deal, but it's a bit of a mess, or we're not sure if we understand it, or certainly maybe you don't understand, you've never seen it before, so the game will be to go through it and figure it out, right? And then present that to everyone else. So you can take a well-trodden path and go along that as well. So 2 talks, written piece. If you want to get into the VAC, which is kind of being loaded up now, but the advanced computing core is available. Lots of data sets around. We actually have 10% of all of Twitter just being piled into a large set of boxes in the VAC all the time. We wrote to them in 2008 and said, this looks like fun. Can we get some data? And there was only 4 of them working there, and they said, sure. And they maybe forgot about us. Anyway, so we're still getting that, so that's nice. Okay, yeah, right. So academic output, right. This is a thing that I kind of make up for, I'm kind of proud of for this course. Let's see, producing, and I put it in here. So these are all the papers that have come out of this course. So, you can look at them if you want. You can certainly go and read them if you want, but all these good things. So there's 20 of them now that are associated with this course in some way. Students who were in the course, working with me perhaps in some way. And And this is not this doesn't include papers that, certainly people wrote with other professors, but I'm happy to support them. So that's a nice product. You shouldn't feel like you need to do that, but that is a possibility. All right, and so we'll go through some possible things soon. Yes, so I kind of encourage this in general. It's what I call the narrative hierarchy. This is a little bit of defense for the first thing, which would be the first talk would be, depending on the size of the class, 3 to 5 minutes long. Now, there are conferences where you have this, and some where you have 30-second talks, and everyone's just lined up. And it's interesting. I mean, you see some people utterly fail at this. You guys won't do this, but you see, professors, and they get up and they're like, well, and they just can't wind it into 30 seconds or 3 minutes. They want their full hour and a half of monologuing, and it doesn't work out. And so anyway, but this is incredibly important for whatever you do. You need to be able to deliver at all these levels. So in movies, you call it the log line, which is the little bit sort of written on the side of the VCR, or beta, I guess. Or I call it the nutshell, excellent bit of nutshelling. And so you need to be able to do these things. If something takes off and some of your work, or you're trying to share it in some way, you need to be able to give it, this tag. And this is not, it is kind of marketing, but it's actually knowledge, right? This is actually knowledge. A lot of graduate students will end up down here for a long time, a lot of suffering. It's a suffering-based exercise. They're down here, they're writing their book, whatever it is, or the giant thing, chapters probably, or papers. And then you ask them what's going on, and they cannot lift up at all, right? They're just like, well, and they need to spend 2 hours explaining to you at Thanksgiving what they're doing. So you need to be able to kind of gauge where you are in the time frame right in front of you, and you need to be able to deliver at all these things. But it is a knowledge thing, because often these parts only come at the end. You said, we're going to work on this thing, blah, 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 but the title might take forever, and getting it down to a couple of words. There's this guy, I'll mention again, Markov, who is an old friend of mine. He's a brain surgeon now in Australia, and he, I remember him telling me in his rounds, because outside the US, right, you go straight out of high school into a field, right? So you're studying medicine, or you're studying, which is pretty scary. But the fellow in charge kept asking them what is medicine, right? And they eventually got it down to 2 words, which was pattern recognition. That might not be what everyone wants to think about medicine, but it was definitely a big piece of it. So getting it down is you're condensing things, you're understanding. Now, of course, marketing lives here, and there's no depth, right? There's no depth. Maybe there's someone who has a product, but then they live up here, and you're very disappointed when your Upworthy email or whatever it is says, I've got all these things, and there's nothing below here. So it's good to have all scales. And that's when you've got something really interesting too. Just very quickly, there are a bunch of centers around. Yeah, I'm going to mention my friend again. This is the book that inspired me, I have to say. So it's 1993. It's of course, it will seem very dated now, but there was a James Gleick's book on chaos was another big inspiration for a lot of people around that time. It's a great book. He's a great writer. But this is about the Santa Fe Institute, and so this is the first place that kind of put together kind of structure around this idea, and they really coined this idea of complex systems and complexity. And there's Nobel laureates involved, right? Murray Gell-Mann is running around talking about quarks, and then you have some from economics appearing and building this center. Nice place to live. You need Los Alamos, so that was the connection. And the idea is we're going to solve everyone's problems. So it didn't really work out. I mean, they're doing all sorts of interesting things. There's a summer school that I've been part of that may be of interest to you. They have produced all sorts of stuff. We'll talk about some of their work as we go through. But it's also, the important thing about this is it really predates data, right? And so that big transition changed things tremendously. The person who gave it to me is our friend Markov here. As I said, he's somehow a practicing brain surgeon now. There are books if you want to read. So this is great, actually. So this is Gleick, I just mentioned, with chaos. This is about information, but it's really a fantastic, interesting thing, I guess, for a certain kind of person. But it is really a great book. It's beautifully written. Really just goes through the whole thing. Back to the alphabet, all sorts of stuff. A colleague of ours who's now at the University of Miami, and kind of He's actually from Oxford, went to Miami, has this very nice book. Melanie Mitchell, who's the Santa Fe Institute, she has an online course, so you can look these books up. These are popular ones. Lots of other things. This is a reprinted now. We're going to be talking about Zipf's work. If you're in economics, you might like this one. It's a very famous piece, Nobel laureate. This is, now it's 10 years old, but Philip Ball's Nature, writes very interesting things all the time, lots of books. But this was connecting the physicists into the social sciences, talking about what was happening there. Some of these books are getting a bit older, I suppose. Modeling complex systems. I think Bakar is a professor, was at Princeton at least, or is. This is more of a cookbook of all sorts of things. Sornetz is a brilliant fellow now in Switzerland. This is more of a social sciences piece. Okay, and I mentioned Melanie Mitchell, so she has an online course. Lara Adamic has an online networks one, and of course there's what you have here. And there are some others around, but Lara has actually just moved to Facebook permanently from Michigan. I'm not sure if you'll be doing that again. Centers, there are a number of centers around the world. These are just a few of them. There's us with our Roboctopus, which we just have. We just have a Roboctopus mascot. Biology, distributed computation, 2/3 of the neurons are in there. Yeah, it's madness. All right. One of us, Josh Bongard, is a roboticist, so this is, there's actually an octopus inside. All right, good. A couple of things to follow that I'd recommend is Complexity Digest. Tweets, puts out things regularly. It's been around for a long time. It just sort of traps stuff. It's to do with complex systems, pretty general. And this is a new magazine that appeared. I had a piece in it last year, which was very nice. But they are it's, again, new sort of general thing. Lots of good stuff about science in general. Okay, so let's talk about this manifesto business. And then I think that will be good for today. Yeah. All right. So, so that's just a bit of everything. Tell you about where we are. So let's frame the whole complex thing. So it's a good word, right? There are framings that appeared before this, like cybernetics, for example. Incredibly famous people are involved with that. It's just not a good word, cybernetics. It really feels like you're building a Schwarzenegger kind of movie or something, right? So it just didn't have the right feel. But it was very much about control. They're trying to build control systems for these. Yeah. Now we kind of understand that's probably not possible in a lot of them. You have to build something that actually the control emerges from it, or it's self-healing or self-regulating in some way. You want to build that kind of system. So not command and control. Very much, absolutely not that. Okay, so good word, right? Obviously we have systems as well, but it's and networks has kind of an interesting heritage. But it's to fold, to weave. This is a good sort of setup. You'll see this now and then. People will talk about complicated not being complex. Complicated sort of things that we've built, right? We've kind of made them. They're complicated things, but you can actually kind of describe the whole thing well. On the other hand, these certainly can become, even these things, certainly airplanes, they can become what we might think of as complex systems, where there's some emergent behavior that was absolutely not expected, right? Your watch doesn't suddenly, make toast for you, and that would be surprising. But you get emergence, definitely with airplanes. Even just sort of functional things like, whether the thing can fly at a certain speed, because you move into a new regime of fluid behavior, and the engineers are all surprised, and so is the pilot, because the wings fall off. For example, just making it up. Okay, but that's sort of true. We saw this recently again with the, I don't know what it is, the Boeing, one of those giant planes where the batteries all explode and the thing caught on fire, and surprises. Bridges, we build bridges that we should know how to do and then make a mess. So that's this notion that these well-engineered systems can become complex, and the power grid, which is a UVM thing, the smart grid story, is a good example of that, right? So we have all these well-designed or pretty well-designed local small power stations, and then they start to be connected for business reasons and all sorts of other reasons. Again, partly for engineering reasons, but they become connected, and you typically, around the world, we've got the continent kind of scale power grids, and sometimes these things go poof. I was actually flying back from Santa Fe to New York City when the big Northeast one, 2003, is that right? Anyway, we were the last plane to land in LaGuardia. Somehow the pilot managed to get in, and it was completely dark, you know, pitch black going in. It's weird. It's weird when big cities have no light left. Everyone slept in Central Park. They didn't go back to New Jersey. It was a strange, strange business. All right, so they can fail spectacularly. We can certainly make them complex, and we can make them fail. Financial systems. Fun times. All right, so you'll see some people talk about complex adaptive systems being, so putting a little sort of algorithmic life kind of feel into it. This is at least Wikipedia at some point. It's not a single theory, which is absolutely true, but what we're talking about is the phenomena of complex systems, right? Theories are other parts. So that's an important thing. There's more than one framework, blah, blah, blah. You know, living, adaptable, changeable systems. Fine. I'm just going to jump these. I'm going to jump these. This is good. So this is a reasonable definition, right? So it's a distributed system in some way. The parts are interrelated, and often we've seen that that's a network story. And there's no clear centralized control. There can be some element of it, but not a full amount. And more is different is here's the little you know, buzz frame for that, the emergent behavior story. So again, you know, you have a dollar bill, and then you have the economy, right? The sort of financial crash is not inside a dollar bill. We don't have emotions inside carbon atoms. You know, somehow you put these things together, and you get a very different behavior. And you know, they're complex algorithmic information systems, but physics, of course, is full of this too, right? So the tornado coming out of water molecules. And we kind of have this sort of strange predilection to think that the thing is like the homunculus theory, right? That inside your brain is a little you sitting there, which is just nuts, right? But I mean, there's sort of this, that's our best explanation. It's like there's another one inside. Anyway, so there are some other pieces. You can have explicit nonlinear pieces in there, but it could be, the nonlinearity could be manifested through a network feedback. Driven from the outside, so the energy is being pushed into it. Memory, of course, memory in these systems doesn't have to be, but that's almost always there. The feedback loops is obvious in a network, and this modularity emerges in a lot of these structures. Right, ridiculous list, but it's everywhere, right? So these systems they're all complex systems, and they're all, you know, it's geophysics. Obviously, lots of things to do with life, but weather systems. So this, and the thing that more and more connects people who are studying all these different pieces are both the kind of general story, like the statistics of some of these things. You know, if you're in earthquakes and you're in, you can actually think about something that's happening with words as well. It's not the same mechanism, but you at least have the right kind of descriptive framework in your head. And then more and more the whole, you know, this sort of deluge of data means that you've got people in different places struggling with the same kinds of problems. So it's a good time. So all these fields are involved, everyone pretty much, except for philosophy maybe. They're pretty good at not being involved. And string theorists are also clever, yeah, because you can't measure anything. So that was brilliant. So you can keep out of it, but it's pretty dangerous. I mean, even the digital humanities, right? I mean, I'll show you this thing at some point where we've got, this is just one thing we're doing, but it's 20,000 books where we have the sentiment kind of time series for all of them, right? So Frankenstein ends badly, science shows that it ends badly. Count of Monte Cristo goes up, right? Escapes. But you know, so you've got all these things you can look at. And that's been around for a while. Counting words has been around for a while, trying to prove Shakespeare was this or that. So it kind of got a bit of a bad name for it, but it's becoming richer and richer, and we talk about distant reading there. Doesn't wipe away books or anything like that, or say that you should never read a book by itself. It just adds to it, right? So a lot of this is complementary and expanding, so that's important. Okay, golden age of reductionism. Postcard, so we've got a postcard for this little bit. And this is good, yep. Hilarious, right? Okay, let's talk about this, because there's some aspects of this that are just important to remember. So we've got, apparently, this is what I understand, Adam comes from this character, Democritus. And so this is, over 2,000 years ago. It's a long time. Said that there's going to be all these little building blocks, right? If we could actually look far enough down, we'd see all these little discrete pieces. An atom means to not be able to cut, indivisible, right? So you couldn't break it. Of course, we got the atoms, and then we've got the whole business with quarks and gluons and things. But I don't know. We haven't cut an electron up, at least. And the strings, we're not going to cut the strings up. Very clever. Okay, very clever, the physicists. All right, if they are obnoxious. Okay, so Plato allegedly said he wanted everything burned by this maniac. It's just, this is nonsense, this is ridiculous. So he's running around saying there are atoms, but everyone else is saying, please be quiet. Okay, so, but the word has been around for a long time. This notion's been around for a long time. Then we get to chemistry, and the alchemists, are trying to do all sorts of crazy things. I've got my lead, and I'm trying to make this other stuff. But they're figuring things out and killing themselves, and whatever. It's a big mess. This goes on for hundreds of years, exploding buildings, and then starting a new building. Ideally, it just lands and you keep going. But this idea of atomic theory starts off. So you might think, okay, we've got the atoms, right? You've done it because you're building out this thing, this periodic table business, right? All right, you guys know what's going on. But actually, no one really believed this, right? So Boltzmann, who was, from what I understand, a depressive character and eventually committed suicide, which is incredibly sad. And I'm not sure if it's true, but I think part of it was just his struggles within academia, that the other physicists didn't believe this guy. So Boltzmann is incredibly famous in statistical mechanics and physics. And he had underneath his theory that there's atoms and molecules bouncing off each other, right? That's what was going on. And all the philosophers and scientists that have got Mach, so Mach speed, they didn't believe in it. He's mad, you're crazy, those things don't exist, right? And then, so I've got this is a long quote. So he went to a conference in St. Louis. Awfully, he was put into a section called Applied Mathematics instead of Physics, so they really were rejecting him. And he had a bit of a go at philosophy. I'm not sure what was up. He was having trouble. He was talking about Lamarck. And then he gets going, right? So acquired characteristics that the people inherited bad philosophy from the past and that it was hard for scientists to overcome such inheritance. So the word philosophy still sort of meant scientist, right? I'll show you, I have a thing later on to mention about science. The word scientist only really appears in the 1850s. It's a new framing. Before it was natural philosopher and men of science. Wow. Were kind of the words that you might use. Okay, so it takes a long time. We get to, it's this guy. This is a pretty smart guy, right? So he had a pretty good year, and one of the papers that came out was about actually these little things bumping off each other, right? And he showed that kind of gave rise to Brownian motion, which had been observed by this guy called Brown 50, 60, 70 years before. And so he showed that this made sense theoretically, that actually you could have all these little things bouncing off each other in a random way, and you'd get this normal distribution. And they're like, this is great. But it's still actually experimental work, and it's in 1908 when you could really see these particles doing this. Right? So now it's like, okay, we have atoms. But that's 1908. I mean, it's only 106 years ago, which is kind of insane. I mean, that's just insane. So in terms of figuring out what the bits are, it's taken us a long time. And it's a very painful, crazy argument. Feynman, who we know is obnoxious by this point, this is a little, he's calming down here. So if something went horribly wrong, and you're only allowed to pass on one sentence, so here's his little soundbite for the cockroaches, or whatever, whoever's left, what statement would contain the most information in the fewest words? You could make up a funny one, but I won't, I guess. So he believes it's this, the atomic hypothesis, right? That things are made of atoms. That would be a great start. So little pieces that move around all the time, attracting each other, bouncing off each other. They don't like being squeezed too much. And in that one sense, you will see there's an enormous amount of information about the world if just imagination and thinking are applied. Now, this is highly debatable, right? But it's an interesting point. I mean, certainly as science grew, it had to go through this. We had to go through this. And we got to, so DNA, right, 1950, so we figured that out. I mean, we just didn't know. And genes, right? So we kind of have this idea of what our other kinds of atoms are, at least our code atoms are. What's the basic piece? And we got way too excited about that, right? So we decided, and you can go back and look at articles from before you were born, probably 1970, 1997, 98, when the whole the genome business was taking off. We're going to solve every problem that humans have ever had, right? No one's going to be obese, everyone's going to be just terrific, no one's going to get drunk anymore. It's going to be great, because we're just going to... And it turns out, and it was ridiculous to say that, but it was good probably for funding purposes. And there certainly are some things that it is a gene that's off in some way. But the ones that are more complex and messier, like lots of, you have these studies where you have 150 genes involved in, say, autoimmune diseases and so on. And so I remember there was an article about 10 years later from the New York Times saying, that didn't really work out the way they said it would. Like it was a reflective piece about the genome business. Okay, so let's have a manifesto. Put the pieces together. Hilarious. Okay, so there's a manifesto. So why we do? So the systems are everywhere for a start, and obviously they're incredibly important. And then much of science, as we emerge from this golden age of reductionism, is about how things fit together. And it's more than just understanding nature, right? So we have this golden age of reductionism. I'm totally saying it. 300 years. We more and more we kind of understand how people behave, individually. I mean, the psychologists have all sorts of they have a mixture of work that can be kind of repeated and not. But we're getting an idea of how it works. I mean, just take street magicians. They're really the best magicians. They very much understand how people will behave in certain ways. So we're getting there with that. And then both understanding the natural systems and the ones we've created, like again the power grid, and financial systems, the ones we've created, in some sense accidentally, and then purposely creating them is really where we have to go now. And that could go, I don't know how long that goes on for, right? Because once you've got the atoms, you've got the atoms. You don't get to have new atoms. Of course, there are atoms for all sorts of systems, and we can make new atoms, right? And smart cars are a kind of atom, if you like, versus people in cars, and they will probably have different emergent disasters. So we get to change things. So as I said before, universality is this big deal. It's about this observed feature of reality, which is that lots of systems with slightly different microscopic descriptions give rise to the same macro behavior. So again, fluids is a good example. So the fact that this is around means we don't need a separate equation description for everything. And this is where we get into actually being able to do something, and it's computers, right? So it makes this science possible. Two pieces. One is we can, of course, measure and record just an enormous amount of data. And if you're a physicist, if you're in the what's it called, the hadron thingamajig, the exploding, we're going to explode Europe business, possibly the universe, black hole. They throw away a ton of the data. They throw away 99% of it because they know they think they know which pieces to keep. We're getting there with astronomy, right? The sky will be completely covered in 2 or 3 days now. This is a big departure from looking through a telescope, which was the case in 1999. Now we have arrays of telescopes and digital stuff coming in. So there's recording, and in some cases I say throwing away. And all these fields go from data scarce to data rich. They just do. Biology did. Now the social sciences are. Doesn't mean we solve all of them, as I said. I think these ones are harder. Right? Feynman's story, actually physics is easy, to be honest. Physics is the easy thing. So they're working on the easy stuff. So, and we, of course, can simulate these systems, right? So we can model them, simulate them, and this is very hard business. There's a lot of madness there, but those two pieces together make all of this possible. We still need the little writing down with the little math and that sort of thing. That can work too, but has to work too. But More and more there's this kind of simulation. Okay, so there's your manifesto. That's where we are today. We're going to talk about power law size distributions on Thursday, and I'll come back to some of this other overview. But yeah, so I talk a lot. You can ask me questions, send me emails, come to office hours, just for the fun of it. Okay? So we're going to have a lot of fun, lots of interesting things, and lots of silliness. All right. Thank you.